In this video, we're going to be looking at variables affecting conformity, and these were investigated by Ash. Notice that this is different from types of conformity and also different from explanations for conformity. So pay really, really close attention whenever you're given a question about conformity. So the variables affecting conformity, here we're looking at situational variables. So we're looking at features of the environment, of the situation, of the context that affect the degree to which individuals conform to group pressure. So under what circumstances can we manipulate the environment to make people more or less likely to conform? So Ash performed a number of variations of his baseline procedure, which you will know very, very well, to investigate the impact of these variables and to look at how they might increase or decrease conformity rates. So we're going to be looking at how Ash investigated group size, unanimity and task difficulty, and the impacts that these had on the rates of conformity in his participants. So let's start by looking at the impact of the group size variable. So how did Ash investigate this variable? He tested group size by altering the number of confederates. So you'll remember in Ash's baseline study, there were sort of 5 to 7 confederates that were actors working on behalf of the investigator who were deliberately giving the wrong answers. And then we had our real participant there, and we were measuring the rate of conformity in that real participant. So Ash investigated group size by varying the number of confederates that were involved. And therefore, this influenced the size of the majority. So he varied the number of confederates from 1 confederate, so we just had 1 confederate acting on behalf of the experimenter, and then our real participant. All the way up to 15. I'm not going to draw all 15 stick figures, but you get the idea. So we wanted to see how group size and the size of the majority would affect conformity of our real, genuine participant. So, very, very interesting findings, and you can see in this graph here exactly what's happened. This is a curvilinear relationship. What we see is that as group size increases, so the number of confederates increases, up to about 3 or so, we see the rates of conformity also increasing. But then it levels off, and this is a really, really interesting finding. So, when there was just 1 confederate who was giving the wrong answer, conformity was at 3%. When there were 2 confederates, conformity was at 13%. 3 confederates, 32%. Notice that this is the same rate of conformity in Ash's baseline experiment. But when we have 15 confederates, conformity decreases slightly. So it's very, very interesting. I wonder if you can think about what might be happening here. So we'll talk about this in lessons, but I just want to give you some thinking time here. So what does this suggest? Well, this suggests that individuals are very sensitive to the views of others. It means that the majority doesn't need to be more than 3. 2 confederates is enough to sway our opinion. But in saying that as well, at the other extreme, we don't need more than 3. 3 is enough. And any more than that, and actually what we might start seeing is suspicion from the participant of the confederates. They might start getting a little bit suspicious that they might all be in on it together. So by the time we get 15 people saying the very obviously wrong answer, people do start to get a bit suspicious. So group size, important to know how Ash investigated this variable, and really important to know the findings here as well. The next variable that Ash investigated was unanimity, whether the group was unanimous. So when we're talking about this unanimity variable, we're talking really about the extent to which all of the members of the group agree. The members of the group, the confederates. Were they all in agreement about the line that was the most correct to the target line? If the first confederate said A, did all of the others say A as well? So Ash investigated this in a couple of ways. He introduced a confederate who disagreed with the other confederates. And so if we think back to our baseline study, here we've got our real participant, second to last, and all of the others are confederates working on behalf of Ash. In the baseline study, all of these confederates would say the same wrong answer. A, 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 A. And we'd look to see how often our real participant would also say A. In this variation, one of the dissenters gave the correct answer. So one of the confederates, for example, this person here, said the correct answer, B. So we wanted to look to see now, in a group that is no longer unanimous, what happens to conformity for our real participant. In another variation, that same dissenter gave a different incorrect answer. So if the correct answer is B, all of our other confederates are saying A. This person is saying C. So they're going against the group majority, but they're saying a different incorrect answer. And what effect is this going to then have on our participant? They found that when there was no longer unanimity in the group, conformity rates decline. When the group is no longer unanimous, conformity drops. So another way that we can phrase this is that when there is the presence of a dissenter or the presence of a non-conforming individual, then conformity drops. So let me just show you what this looks like in a bit of a better drawing there rather than my stick figures. So in the first unanimity variation that Ash conducted, the dissenter gave the correct answer. And in that case, conformity dropped from 32% in his baseline study to 5.5%. When this happens, when our dissenting confederate gives the correct answer, this gives our participant the confidence to reject the majority, so they can behave more independently. We've heard somebody say the correct answer. Okay, maybe I can too. And so that can explain conformity in Ash's first variation on unanimity. In the second variation, this is where our dissenter, or our dissenting confederate, gave a different incorrect answer. Interestingly, conformity still dropped. It didn't drop as much as when our dissenter gave the correct answer, but it still dropped to 9%. This is very, very interesting. This suggests to us that actually what's happening here is not necessarily that the dissenting confederate is giving us useful information, but they're giving us the confidence to answer independently because they're breaking the unanimity of the group and because they're providing us with some sort of social support or some sort of solidarity, that it's okay to break against the group. It's okay to push back and to not conform, even if they're giving another incorrect answer. So it suggests the key in reduction in majority agreement rather than naive participant being given correct support. We're going to come back to these later on when we look at resistance to social influence. These studies, my pen's gone a bit funny there. These studies are going to be crucial. Okay. The third and final variable that Ash investigated was task difficulty. So he wanted to see what influence this would have on conformity. He did this by making the stimulus line and the comparison lines much closer in length. You'll see here that there's actually not much difference between the lengths of each of these lines. So this means that it's harder then for our participant to accurately judge the correct line. And what did Ash find? Well, Ash found that conformity increases when task difficulty increases. When people are less certain about the correct answer, they're more likely to look to the group for guidance. And this, remember, can be best explained by informational social influence. When we look to the group in order to be right. The more ambiguous the task, the more uncertain we are with the right answer, the more likely individuals are to look to others for guidance, assuming that the group has got access to the correct information, assuming that the group is right. Now, just a word of warning here. Proceed very, very carefully with any questions into conformity. You need to be very, very aware of the difference between questions that ask you to explain how Ash investigated variables affecting conformity and explain how variables investigated by Ash were found to affect conformity. If you're asked to explain how Ash investigated these variables, you're being asked to describe the procedure. For example, task difficulty, he made the lines closer together in length. If you're asked to explain how the variables investigated by Ash were found to affect conformity, here we need to focus on the findings. My suggestion would be to do lots and lots of practice questions here to make sure that you're able to pick up on this subtle change to the wording. Okay, so we're going to have a look now at evaluation. We're looking at AO3 points. Remember that each of these needs to be made into a Peel paragraph. What I would suggest is that you've got 4 points here. This point about highly controlled research is not particularly developed. There's not that much you can say. So I would perhaps combine this with artificial task and situation and have this as your counter argument. So therefore you've got a strength with a counter argument and then 2 limitation paragraphs. This might be one that you plan and you attempt to write under timed conditions. All right, so let's get started. Let's look at highly controlled research first of all. Okay, one of the major strengths of Ash's research into the variables affecting conformity is that the studies were highly controlled. Fabulous, highly controlled. We know that this is going to affect internal validity. We know that this increases replicability and therefore we can be more confident in the findings. But let's go beyond that superficial level and actually break down what was standardized, what was controlled in Ash's research. Ash's research was standardized. He used standardized instructions and procedures. For example, the line lengths were the same for all participants to eliminate task difficulty as an unintentional extraneous variable. Obviously, in the line length variation, he deliberately altered this. This became his independent variable. But in all other cases, the line lengths were kept absolutely consistent. We know that our participant was always seated second to last. If they were seated first, then obviously they're not going to be affected by the group because they're giving their answer before the majority do. And so it's very, very important to maintain the exact same position where the participant was seated in every iteration of this experiment. And all participants were deceived. They were all told that it was going to be a visual perception task, and that's obviously very important to reduce demand characteristics. As we've spoken about before, if participants understood that the experiment was about conformity, then we're likely to yield very, very different results. Another way in which this research is highly controlled is that Ash actually used control trials before the critical trials began. So before the majority and the Confederates started giving the intentional wrong answer, they did a few normal rounds where they were giving the right answer. And this meant that the researchers, that Ash, could actually test that the participants were able to do the task properly. If participants were getting it wrong even before the Confederates were giving the wrong answer, then it would suggest that there was actually something wrong with their eyesight and they couldn't complete this task appropriately. And so these control trials, typically he would do 3 control trials before the real critical trials began. And so that way we can eliminate any potential extraneous variables, and we can ensure then at that point that any incorrect responses from our participants was due to conformity and not due to the fact that they couldn't complete this task. So what does all of this mean? Well, this means that Ash's findings regarding the variables affecting conformity are likely to be valid. What we know about the effects of unanimity and task difficulty and group size is likely to be correct. We can be more confident in those findings. However, one of the major criticisms of Ash's research is that it was a child of its time. That is sort of the classic quote that's associated with Ash's research. It therefore is being criticised for having low temporal validity. This is a term that we came across earlier in the year. It doesn't really apply to memory research because cognition and memory hasn't really changed so much in the last 50 years. But our social attitudes certainly have. And for this reason, it can be very, very difficult to be certain that the findings from Ash's research would apply today. So let's just break this down. What do I mean by Ash's research being a child of its time? Ash's studies took place in 1950s America. This was known as the McCarthy era, and it was marked by McCarthyism. McCarthyism is basically the practice of making accusations of treason, especially against communists, without really any regard for proper evidence, not unlike what we see happening in America today. So McCarthyism's marked by conservative, anti-communist views and witch hunts against anybody who was thought to hold sympathetic left-wing views. Conformity was expected. Anybody that was seen to be dissenting, going against the norm, going against traditional American values, was persecuted, or there was attempts to persecute them. So we have to really question then, in the 1950s, were people conforming because of this fear, because of this idea of McCarthyism? And would the findings from Ash's experiment apply today? Would people be as conforming as they were in 1950s America? Well, we need to look at more contemporary research to answer this question. So Perrin and Spencer did just that, and in 1981 they replicated Ash's study, and they found markedly different results. They found that conformity was just 0.25%. Obviously, this is in comparison to the 32% that Ash found. This suggests that Ash's findings simply reflected 1950s America and that the findings are not applicable to today. The researchers, Perrin and Spencer, argued that a cultural change had taken place. And nowadays, actually, students are stereotypically very free-thinking, very independent, very non-conforming. And that way, Ash's findings regarding the variables affecting conformity may not apply to this era. However, we need to actually then consider the validity of Perrin and Spencer's research, and that's why I've put this little note in here. There were some differences between Perrin and Spencer's replication and Ash's original baseline studies. So Perrin and Spencer's research took place in the UK rather than the US, and it took place with students who were studying maths, engineering, or chemistry undergraduate degrees. So there might be some reasons that we need to sort of pause here and not just assume that because Perrin and Spencer found much lower conformity rates that means today generally conformity is lower. This could just be unique to UK students who are studying maths, engineering and chemistry. And if we think about these sorts of students, we're talking about people who care about precision, who perhaps are more likely to go with the right answer rather than conform to the group's incorrect answer because they're confident. They're not conforming perhaps due to ISI, where we look to others to be right, because these are smart, these are intelligent, these are hardworking people, and therefore they may not need to look to the group for guidance. They may be confident enough in their ability to judge line lengths, which they might be doing for their engineering or chemistry degrees, having to judge the amount of liquid in a beaker, for example. So there might be reasons that we actually just need to pause here and consider how effective Perrin and Spencer's research is when criticising Ash. In any case, we need to still consider the 1950s America McCarthy era was marked by high levels of conformity, and we may not see that today. We also have to consider the artificial task and situation that Ash set up here. This is very unlike conformity we would expect to see in the real world. Ash's research used artificial tasks and took place in a very controlled lab environment. All those strengths we spoke about earlier, about his standardization and the use of control trials, can be detrimental when we're trying to study social psychology. So let's break this down. Let's go beyond the superficial and say that therefore it has low ecological validity and it might be difficult to apply the findings. Let's break it down. The first thing that we need to consider is the task participants were required to do. A line judgment task. Tell me which line is closest to the target line in length. Who cares? This task is trivial. This task has absolutely no consequences if you get the answer wrong or if you conform to the group. There are literally no consequences to you or to anybody else for conforming or not conforming. There are no social consequences. Unlike, for example, being socially rejected by your peers for not wearing the right thing, or failing a test because you didn't copy the answers from the person next to you, or, for example, being part of a jury where somebody's life is potentially on the line. So a line judgment task is very, very different to real-life situations where people might or might not be conforming. We also have to consider this group that Ash used. The groups of the Confederates and the participants were unknown to each other. They were strangers. That's not very groupy. We have to consider that in real life contexts, we're mostly conforming to people who belong to our in-group. rather than people who are unknown to us. So conformity in real life might be higher because we care about our peers, we care about maintaining those social relationships. Whereas when it's strangers who are never going to see again, who cares? There are no consequences for not conforming. Another point that we might want to talk about is the fact that the Confederates that Ash used were not trained actors. These were just other students. They might not have been very good. I know that when we did this task in class, it was easy for us because we all had our cameras off, but if you're looking at people and they're lying, they might not be able to hide that. They might unintentionally give that away. And so therefore our participants might have been responding to demand characteristics. They might have known, right, these people are faking it. I don't want to look stupid, so I'm going to give the right answer, for example. So we need to really question whether we can actually apply the findings from Ash's research into the variables affecting conformity to real-life social settings, where the consequences of conformity might actually be really important. So when we're talking about peer pressure or juries, for example. A better real-life task might, of course, be the elevator study. I'm sure you've seen this video. This is where we have people going into an elevator and everybody's facing the wrong way, and we see whether people do the same. But again, even in that situation, it's a little bit more real life, but again, there are still no consequences. And this kind of research lacks the control over extraneous variables that Ash was able to control. Ash's research for the issues with generalizability. In other words, it's low population validity. Ash's studies all took place with American male undergraduate students. And we need to question whether the findings and the rates of conformity that Ash found with this particular sample would apply to other samples. So we need to consider whether there's perhaps any gender bias or culture bias. So Ash's research has been criticised for beta bias. Beta bias is when we ignore or minimise sex differences, assuming that men and women behave and respond in the same way, when in actual fact, women might not conform and might not respond to these variables in the same way as men. Ash may have mistakenly applied his findings to women when their conformity rates might be different. So we know from research that men are, on average, more concerned about appearing to have high status than women. And part of a way that men might demonstrate this status is by acting independently, by not conforming, by standing their ground. So we might see, in that case, lower levels of conformity amongst men than women. Likewise, women are more concerned with connecting with others. They care about maintaining group harmony, they care about preventing social disagreement, and so they're perhaps more likely to conform than men. And so we really need to conduct this research with women to be sure that the findings that Ash found in regards to the rates of conformity for each of his variables, to see if that would be consistent between men and women. We also need to question whether there is any culture bias in Ash's research. So again, Ash was just studying males from the US, and this may not reflect conformity around the world. We need to consider collectivist cultures. I know that this is a little bit of an outdated term nowadays, but collectivist cultures where the needs of the group are put above the needs of the individual. And so this is where typically we might live in closer family structures, and people would, rather than put themselves first, they would put their family first. So the needs of the group are above the needs of the individual. And Smith and Bond have conducted a number of studies on conformity using Ash's method, and found that the rates of conformity differ all around the world. In Fiji, a collectivist culture, rates of conformity are increased to 58%, and in Belgium, they're as low as 14%. I am proud to say that the least conforming of all people around the world are Australian women when we conduct Ash's studies around the world. So I'm very, very proud of that fact. So the idea is here that Ash's research might not apply to women and it might not apply to different cultures. And so Ash's findings about the variables affecting conformity are not universal, and they may tell us very little about the factors that influence conformity in women and individuals from some cultures.